My name is Rowan Ellis, and the day everything quietly cracked open started with a single sentence from my older sister, a sentence so ordinary in tone that it took a few seconds for its meaning to settle like dust after a collapse. I had called her early that morning, half asleep and still clutching a mug of coffee, expecting a routine update about my mother's health. Instead, Mara laughed softly in a way I hadn't heard in years and said, "We handled everything, Rowan. You don't need to come. We already had the surgery last week. Just family was allowed." I froze mid-breath, the warmth of the cup fatting against my palms while her voice drifted through the speaker, casual, unhurried, as if she hadn't just carved out an absence where I should have stood. For a moment I thought I misheard her, that maybe she meant something else. But she repeated it with the same ease, only family. I stared at the muted sunlight spilling across my kitchen counter, hearing the words echo long after she ended the call. Only family. As though the years I spent arranging appointments, paying bills, and coordinating prescriptions counted for nothing. As though the person who handled every emergency didn't qualify for the circle she claimed to protect. When the call ended, I set my phone down and felt a slow shift inside my chest, a heaviness I'd learned to swallow in small doses, but never in a single sharp gulp. I checked my email out of instinct and saw a series of medical confirmations, payments processed, invoices addressed to me, reminders for follow-up visits. All of them dated before the procedure she said had already happened. They had used my information, my money, my planning, then shut me out of the moment that mattered most. I didn't call back. I didn't demand an explanation. Silence, I realized, has a way of revealing the truth more clearly than confrontation ever could. And the truth was simple. I had become the person who managed emergencies, not the person they welcomed into the room. I spent the rest of that morning moving through my apartment in a quiet daze. My place in Portland had always felt like a middle point between two lives, my own and the one my family kept pulling me into. The walls still held faint reminders of the years after my fiancé left, when I rebuilt myself around routines that felt safe. Morning runs, carefully meal-prepped dinners, late-night spreadsheets from my job as a senior data analyst. On paper, my life looked like order, stability, adult competence, but beneath it lived a constant hum of responsibility I never questioned. My father passed when I was 23, leaving behind a pile of debts and a house sinking under unpaid repairs. Mara, brilliant but dramatically impractical, drifted between artistic jobs and crises that always required immediate financial rescue. My younger brother Theo burned through part-time gigs like they were temporary costumes, each worn briefly before he slipped out of them and returned home empty-handed. And my mother, gentle but chronically overwhelmed, carried sorrow the way some people carry handbags, never putting it down long enough to consider how heavy it had become. For years, I stepped in whenever the seams split. When the roof leaked, I wired funds before the first patch was laid. When Theo crashed his second car, I paid the towing fee without waiting for his explanation. When Mara needed supplies for an upcoming show she swore would change her life, I transferred money before she could spiral into panic. And when Mom's health started to decline, I rearranged work schedules, booked appointments, and sent payments quietly so she wouldn't feel guilty asking. It was easy to label it as duty, family, responsibility. It felt almost noble until it didn't, until every call from home became a question shaped into a plea, until I noticed that, "How are you?" had turned into a silent throat-clearing before the real request arrived. One night, long before the surgery incident, I opened a spreadsheet and created a tab labeled Household Support. I filled it with every payment, every transfer, each note a small record of a moment I tried to hold things together. The total grew faster than I expected, numbers accumulating silently like emotional interest I never agreed to. Each entry became a marker of a role I never consciously accepted, but never refused either. After Mara's call, I found myself staring at that spreadsheet again. Lines I hadn't looked at in months stretched across the screen, a quiet map of how far I had drifted from the person I once imagined I'd become. I closed the file and tried to return to my workday, but the shift inside me had already begun, quiet, deliberate, irreversible. The following week passed strangely, as if the world had adjusted its weight. I answered emails, attended meetings, and reviewed quarterly datasets with mechanical steadiness. No one at the office knew anything was wrong, and I didn't try to explain. Data behaved predictably. People didn't. And my family, I realized, had grown used to a version of me that existed only when they needed something steady, accommodating, endlessly available. On Thursday evening, as rain tapped lightly against my windows, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Theo. A familiar one. Rent late. Need help. Urgent. No mention of the surgery. No question about why I hadn't shown up. No acknowledgement that I'd been cut out entirely. Just the same expectation as always, as if my absence had been convenient rather than deliberate. Something inside me settled with unexpected clarity. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a simple reply. I can't help right now. No explanation. No apology. Just a boundary where none had ever existed. Then I put the phone face down and let the quiet spread through my apartment like a long overdue exhale. The next morning, I opened my banking app and moved through the routine transfers. Car insurance for Mom. Auto pay for Theo's utilities. Monthly top-ups for Mara's art materials. One by one, I canceled them. Each cancellation popped up like a small door closing, soft, final, echoing in a way I felt more in my ribs than in my mind. I updated passwords next. Accounts, devices, cloud storage, barriers I never thought I needed. And when I finished, the apartment felt still. Not empty. Not lonely. Just mine. For the first time, I noticed how my place looked without crisis pulling at the edges. My coffee table held books I meant to read. My plants leaned toward the window, patient and thriving. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. A few days later, I installed a new lock. A technician named Emery arrived with a kind, straightforward demeanor and replaced my old deadbolt with a reinforced one. He also mounted a small camera near my doorway and showed me how to monitor the feed. When he left, the door shut with a solidness that startled me, like a sound I'd been waiting years to hear. For a while. Nothing happened. I checked the camera occasionally out of habit, seeing only an empty hallway washed in soft fluorescent light. I convinced myself they hadn't noticed the shift yet, that maybe the boundaries would settle quietly, unchallenged. I was wrong. The confrontation came one gray afternoon while I was sorting laundry. My phone chimed sharply, motion detected. I opened the camera feed. 3 figures approached my door. Mara, wrapped in an oversized coat, her posture sharpened by irritation. Theo, holding his phone like a shield. And behind them, a man in a charcoal suit carrying a sleek leather folder. My mother wasn't there. The absence was loud. I walked to the door and opened it just enough to see them clearly while keeping the new lock in place. The man in the suit stepped forward and introduced himself with the kind of rehearsed politeness lawyers practice in front of mirrors. He explained that he represented my siblings and wanted to discuss financial obligations previously understood within the family unit. His phrasing felt like a net being woven midair, its shape disguised as concern. He spoke about expectations, about the abrupt nature of my withdrawal, about harmful destabilization. Beneath each sentence lay a single truth. They wanted to compel me back into the pattern. He handed me a packet thick with legal intention, the pages outlining requests that read more like demands. Their eyes studied me, Mara's sharp, Theo's restless. I listened. I didn't react. When he finished, I handed the packet back. Any legal matters, I said calmly, can follow the appropriate channels. No anger, no explanation, just a door they couldn't rewrite. I closed the door before they found new words to try. The latch clicked with the soft finality of a decision-taking route. Through the camera, I watched them linger, frustrated, agitated, whispering sharply before leaving one by one. Later that evening, a letter appeared in my mailbox. Formal language, cold structure, clear intent, threats disguised as procedure. I placed it on the table and sat beside it. Not afraid, not surprised, simply aware of how predictable this had become. The next day, I reached out to the only person who noticed the smallest shifts in my voice, my colleague and friend, Lena Hart. We'd shared late lunches, project frustrations, and quiet conversations that made difficult days feel possible. When I texted her and asked if she was free after work, she responded within seconds. We met at a tiny cafe tucked behind a bookstore, the air warm with espresso and quiet chatter. When I told her everything, about the surgery, the boundary, the confrontation, she didn't interrupt. She didn't pity me. Her expression simply tightened with recognition, not shock. When I finished, she leaned forward, her voice steady in a way that made the room feel anchored. "Rowan," she said, "this isn't the moment everything changed. This is the moment you finally saw what had been happening all along." And something about hearing it aloud shifted the ground beneath me in a way nothing else had. because she was right. The rupture wasn't new. The awareness was, and once awareness arrives, nothing can return to the shape it held before. I left the cafe that night with Lena's words settling inside me like stones sinking into deep water, not heavy in a suffocating way, but grounding, clarifying, the kind of weight that tells you where the bottom finally is. The city air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't decided whether to fall or pass by. I walked slowly, letting the streetlights stretch long shadows across the pavement, thinking about every moment I had mistaken obligation for belonging. For years I had believed I could fix what was broken at home with enough effort, consistency, or sacrifice. But standing there with the sounds of traffic humming around me, I understood how much of my life had been shaped by the quiet fear of disappointing people who were never trying to meet me halfway. When I reached my apartment, I paused by the door before unlocking it, noticing how different it felt to step into a space that wasn't a waiting room for the next emergency. The hallway camera blinked softly, casting a faint glow. I checked the feed out of habit, half expecting to see another uninvited visit. The frame was empty. The silence was clean. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and stepped inside. For the next few days, I moved through my routines with a new kind of awareness, sharp, steady, and almost unfamiliar. I cooked dinner without checking my phone every few minutes. I slept through the night without replaying years of conversations where I agreed to things I wasn't ready for. At work, I noticed how much energy I still had after 5 p.m., energy I'd forgotten I could use for myself. But beneath all of it ran a faint tension, a quiet knowing that my family wasn't done reaching for me. They had never handled boundaries well. They had never treated no as a complete sentence, and I knew they would try again. I just didn't know when. The answer came the following Thursday. I was leaving the office late after finishing a quarterly report, the last few employees trailing behind me toward the elevators. The sky outside had deepened into a dusky blue, the kind that made city windows glow like constellations. As I reached the parking garage, my phone vibrated with a call from an unknown number. I almost let it ring out. Something in my chest tightened, a flicker of intuition that felt too specific to ignore. I answered. A voice I didn't recognize introduced himself as Officer Grant from the local police department. My pulse quickened for a split second before he clarified. There had been a welfare check request filed for me earlier that afternoon. According to the report, my family believed I was in emotional distress after a sudden behavioral shift, and they were concerned for my safety. He spoke carefully, clearly accustomed to navigating delicate situations. I felt heat crawl up my neck, not from fear but from the realization of what my siblings had done. They weren't worried about me. They weren't checking on my well-being. They were escalating pressure, using institutions as tools to force me back into compliance. I assured the officer I was fine, standing in the middle of a well-lit parking structure with my work badge still around my neck. He asked a few routine questions, confirmed my identity, and closed the report without issue. But as soon as the call ended, I stood still for a long moment, fingers tightening around my phone. It was one thing to send a lawyer, another to stage a welfare call to paint me as unstable. The pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was a strategy. I drove home slowly, letting the implications settle like unwelcome guests taking seats around a table I didn't remember setting. When I reached my apartment, I went straight to my desk and opened my laptop. Instead of a spreadsheet, I pulled up a blank document and began typing. Not notes, not a letter, a timeline. Every incident, every request, every moment where boundaries were ignored or weaponized. I wrote about the surgery they hid, the money they quietly used, the lawyer they hired, the visit at my door, the welfare check. I didn't write with emotion. I wrote with precision. Line by line, I recorded the truth so I could see the shape of it in front of me. When I finished, the document stretched across pages. A story I never intended to tell had formed in black text across a white screen. And as I sat back, rubbing the tension from my forehead, I realized none of this was about money anymore. It was about control. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer of my own. Her name was Evelyn Carter, recommended by a colleague who had gone through a complicated estate dispute the year before. When I called her office, she agreed to meet the same afternoon. Her voice carried a calm efficiency I immediately trusted. When I entered her workspace, a small office lined with tall plants and orderly stacks of folders, She gestured for me to sit and asked me to start from the beginning. I handed her the printed timeline instead. She read it slowly, expression unreadable, turning each page with deliberate care. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a mix of sympathy and professional sharpness. "You've been enabling them for a long time," she said gently, "and they've built their lives around that access." I nodded, though the truth of it still stung. "They're escalating because they're afraid the dynamic is changing," she continued. "Not because they don't understand your boundaries, but because they do." For the first time, someone had articulated what I hadn't allowed myself to fully admit. Evelyn laid out my options with clarity. Document everything, avoid direct confrontation, retain records of all interactions, and if necessary, file a cease and desist order should the harassment continue. It felt surreal to consider legal distance between myself and the people I grew up with, but each step she described felt like reinforcement added to a door they had pushed open for far too long. When I left her office, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. The air outside tasted different, not lighter, not heavier, just more honest. By the time I reached home, the hallway camera blinked again. Another notification. My stomach tightened, expecting the worst. But this time the feed showed someone I didn't expect, my mother. She stood alone. No Mara, no Theo, no lawyer. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, her hands clutched around a small envelope. She glanced toward the camera with an expression so conflicted it made something in my chest twist, not guilt, not fear, but a softness I had stopped believing she possessed. I walked to the door slowly, unsure of what version of her I would face. When I opened it, she looked up at me with eyes that carried an exhaustion far older than my childhood. "Hi, sweetheart," she said quietly, her voice thin as thread. I didn't step aside, not yet. She didn't try to push past me. She simply held out the envelope with trembling fingers. "This is for you," she whispered. I took it without opening it. We stood in silence, the air between us thick with everything unsaid. She finally breathed out, "I didn't know they filed anything. I didn't know about the lawyer until after. I didn't know how to stop them." Her words wavered under the weight of truth and excuses, woven so tightly I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I didn't respond. She continued, voice cracking slightly. "They're scared, Rowan. They think you're leaving them for good." I stared at her, unsure how to explain that I had been leaving slowly for years. They had simply never noticed. Before she could say more, I gently told her I needed space. Real space. Space they could not step into whenever things became inconvenient. My mother nodded once, small, resigned, and stepped back from the doorway. "I love you," she murmured, though her eyes carried the knowledge that love had not been the currency exchanged in our family for a long time. When she walked away, I closed the door quietly, the reinforced lock clicking into place with a firmness that felt both protective and sorrowful. Inside, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, me at 10 years old, sitting on our old porch steps with a birthday cake on my lap, my family gathered around me. Everyone was smiling. My mother had written a sentence on the back in small, uneven handwriting. "I wish I had protected this version of you better." I sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, the photograph resting in my lap. Emotions rolled through me in slow waves, not anger, not forgiveness, but something in between. A recognition of how far we had all drifted from the people we once hoped to be. That night, for the first time in months, I let my apartment stay completely silent. No music, no television, just the steady hum of the city outside my window. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle without rushing to fill it. There were still unanswered questions. There were still conflicts waiting. There were still choices I would have to make. But for the first time in my adult life, I could feel the shape of a future that belonged to me, not as a caretaker, not as a financial lifeline, not as a fallback option, but as myself. A self I was still learning to meet again. And somewhere deep inside that quiet, something shifted, not like a break, but like a beginning.